talk about the right to die. Bodily autonomy is defined as the right to self-governance over one's own body without external influence or coercion. I think that many people, especially those in this room, would agree that this is a fundamental human right. So why is modern culture seemingly so opposed to it? Culturally sanctioned euthanasia dates back at least as far as ancient Greece, but the development of monotheistic Judeo-Christian teachings led to a heavy bias against the notion of killing oneself, no matter what form it takes. This religious prescription against suicide was and is so strong that the act was illegal until the 1960s in England and is still considered a felony in some of the United States. In fact, I was not aware when I named this talk that assisted suicide is actually a term that the Catholic Church originated. In the same way that they've twisted the anti-choice movement by calling it pro-life, the church wants people to hear the word suicide and think sin. So what reason do people have to want to end their life through medical aid? In some cases, it's terminal illness, like cancer, Parkinson's, chronic disease. For others, they simply do not wish to continue living. No matter what the reason, death with dignity allows human beings the option to end their life on their own terms in a non-violent way that causes the least amount of suffering and trauma to them and to their loved ones. Who has the right to end a life, and why? And what does it mean to make assumptions that a life is or is not worth living? At what point do the sometimes competing ideas of best interest, individual freedom, and the inherent goodness of life overlap? And when do they contradict each other? Today I will cover a brief history of the right to die movement in the US and present both sides of the argument regarding this highly divisive issue. So Derek Humphrey is considered to be the founding father of the right to die movement after he helped his wife, who was dying from breast cancer, take her own life in 1975. 5 years later, in 1980, he established the Hemlock Society out of his garage in California, which was the United States' first right to die organization. Over the next 12 years, the organization grew to over 80 chapters with the mission to help terminally ill people die peacefully and fight the laws that prevent physician-assisted suicide. That organization lasted until 2003. By 1990, a contemporary of Humphrey's, Dr. Jack Kevorkian, you may have heard of him, had invented his suicide machine called the Thanatron, which literally meant death machine. And in June of that year, his first patient used it to end their own life. Dr. Death, as he was called, was responsible for about 130 deaths over the course of his career and was ultimately sent to prison in 1999 for possessing and administering a cocktail for a lethal injection, convicted of second-degree murder. Kevorkian's controversial methods were and still are highly contested, even within the right to die community. He was once quoted as saying, "We are all terminal." Many of his patients were not actually terminally ill, which is why people were so mad at him. I really wish that I had time to just give a talk on him because he was really, really fascinating, but we'll move on. In 1994, Oregon passed what is known as the Death with Dignity Act, and that measure, which is still in place, allows terminally ill patients who are likely to die within 6 months to obtain a prescription for lethal medication from a doctor. Patients have to be 18 years of age or older, and they have to have the ability to demonstrate that they're capable of making their own decisions. This act, the Death with Dignity Act, exists in just 9 states, including Washington State. It wasn't until 1995 that the real change began to take place. The Journal of American Medical Association published the Support Study, which was an invaluable look at the end-of-life care aimed to improve end-of-life decision-making and reduce the frequency of mechanically supported, painful, and prolonged process of dying. The study was conducted at 5 teaching hospitals with over 9,000 adults hospitalized with 1 or more life-threatening diagnoses. And it exposed major shortcomings in communication between doctors and patients about their wishes, such as whether patients wanted to avoid CPR or be resuscitated. It also reported that half of the conscious patients who died in the hospital had been in, quote, severe or moderate pain, unquote, according to their families. The study led to the expansion of palliative care, which focuses on pain relief and prevention in hospitals nationwide. Painful and prolonged dying is a point that the famous radio talk show host Diane Rehm returns to over and over again. Her latest book, which is called When My Time Comes, draws from her personal experience watching her husband, who was suffering from Parkinson's disease, die an excruciating and drawn-out death after being denied the right to die on his own terms in the state of Maryland. I listened to her on NPR last week in an interview about the book, and it was heartbreaking to hear her recount the agony of watching her husband choose to starve and dehydrate himself to death, which is a common way that patients who are not allowed to end their lives in a medically assisted way choose to do things. She actually ended up missing his death, so he was living in assisted care, and she went home to take a shower. She knew that he was close, but she just missed it by like 20 minutes. So she wasn't able to spend the last few minutes of his life with him. But if he'd been able to choose when he died, she could have done that. In those moments, in moments like that and in stories like that, it's much easier to see why the right to die is a clear choice. But there's another side of things. What about those who are struggling with mental illness, like depression and anxiety, or people with disabilities, and those disabilities exhaust them to the point of suicide? This is where the argument gets more complicated. I've been repeatedly returning to one such case regarding a young woman from the Netherlands. Her name was Aurelia Browers. She was granted the right to die when she was 29 years old, and her reasoning was that she was suffering from a ton of mental health comorbidities. Aurelia Browers was diagnosed with depression at age 12. She'd also experienced eating disorders, anxiety, borderline personality disorder, and heard voices in her head. By the time that she sought out culturally sanctioned euthanasia, she had been in psychiatric care for most of her life, but had still tried to commit suicide a multitude of times. Every attempt she made failed. The doctors would always say to her, "Oh, you have such a healthy heart, you have such healthy lungs." She was determined to die, though. The laws regarding death with dignity in the Netherlands are way more permissive than any other country. The doctor has to feel that the patient's symptoms are, quote, unbearable with no prospect of improvement, and if there is no other reasonable alternative in the patient's situation, then they grant access to this right. For Browers, that was true. She had spent her life trying therapy and medication. She just didn't want to be here. She said, "I'm stuck in my own body, my own head, and I just want to be free. I have never been happy. I don't know the concept of happiness." Her doctors said that she seemed unwell, except for when she talked about euthanasia. So they said, like, all of their doctor's notes were, she's losing her mind, she's not speaking clearly, but every time she would revisit the right to die, she was perfectly crystal clear. She knew she wanted it. She ended up getting the right to do this. She died peacefully, surrounded by family and friends in January of 2018. I think she chose the compassionate way to die, for herself and for others, and followed through on it. And of course, her death sparked a huge upset. People were worried that someone who was so ill didn't have full mental capacity or the understanding of the extent of her decision. It's an understatement to say that this piece of the euthanasia conversation is fuzzy, but I do think that the issue can be diagnosed. Simply put, we have not made a world where people with chronic illnesses, mental or physical, can be comfortable or find relief. As covered in last week's talk on ableism, people with disabilities are shunned from public places, they're paid less, or made unemployable in the fine print of job descriptions, and they suffer immensely for things beyond their control. Many, if not most, people with mental illness don't have access to therapy or medication or support groups. They're ostracized, mocked, and isolated. How can we expect some of them not to seek freedom from a society that does not support them? The deficit of compassion and empathy in our society is the root of the issue for me. Not just personally, but structurally. In the United States in particular, we tend to default to a me and mine mentality, which is harmful on multiple levels. First, it prevents us from seeing the world beyond our own noses. It's solipsistic, like we assume that our experience is the experience of everyone else, which closes us off to so many perspectives, and it decreases our ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. Secondly, it makes us selfish. We hold on to things beyond their expiration date. That includes ideas, material belongings, and people. In that same interview with Diane Rehm on NPR, she mentioned that the biggest perpetrators of keeping family members alive when they do not wish to live are boomers. This could be controversial or it could be obvious, but I think that there's a direct connection between the Reagan-era consumerism of the 1980s and the ways in which boomers are different than any other generation. When you grow up in a world that emphasizes buying and owning material things, the success of the wealthy, and a mentality that says, fuck everyone else, I worked for what I have, you can end up forming some really harmful ideas and patterns about how to treat people, especially in their final moments. You didn't think that I would make it through this talk without ranting about capitalism, did you? The heart of my talk and the depth of my feelings about this issue are these. It is hard for us as reasonably healthy human beings to honestly understand what the experience is like for someone who wishes to die, really wishes to die. I mentioned Aurelia Browers earlier, so there was another woman who also lived in the Netherlands. She was very depressed, she had BPD, she didn't want to live, she went and filled out the paperwork, but she never filed it. And that was because she was able to seek the help that she needed, and that help worked. Anyway, we're challenged by, we tend to sympathize rather than empathize with someone who is sick because there's a natural inability to put yourself in shoes that you've never worn. We're challenged by the requirement to see beyond our own selfish impulses, the ones that say, but I'll miss my friend or my grandmother, my parent if they die. And instead, we need to be focusing on the needs of the sick person. I volunteered to do this talk for somebody else, another member of our group who works in hospice care. And I remember the feeling in their voice when they expressed how critical it is for humans to be able to exercise their right to die. I cannot imagine seeing people suffer like that and not have that same feeling, so I was happy to take this on. I believe that one's body is inviolable, subject to one's own will alone. Let's discuss.